Welcome to Adventures of a Bystander. Today, our guest is Dr. Elizabeth Richmond Garza, Dr. RG. Dr. RG is a professor of comparative literature here at the University of Texas in Austin. She specializes in modern European drama, the Gothic movement, literary theory, and Oscar Wilde, a love both of us share. In this wide-ranging discussion, I got a chance to learn about Dr. RG's own intellectual journey, from being part of a German philosophy club when she was 14 to studying Renaissance theater as a grad student here in New York. We talked about her philosophy towards teaching, about Oscar Wilde, the Gothic novel, the state of the liberal arts today, relevance of the humanities for STEM students, and so much more. This was a wide-ranging discussion with tons of TIL moments, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the brilliant Dr. RG. Dr. RG, welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, when we were talking offline a couple of days before, I was very fascinated by when I was hearing about you were growing up as bilingual. I grew up bilingual. You started learning Latin when you were like 10. I was reminded of this thing by Schopenhauer when he talked about how the things we learned during our childhood start serving as rubrics for later in our lives, right? So I was curious, like when you were growing up in a family of academics. So how was childhood like? What were you growing up reading? What were those early impressions like?
So it's a lovely question because I think I owe a great deal to my parents for having defied the advice that both sides of our family gave, bringing us up with multiple languages, bringing us up in multiple locations. They were told under no circumstances, take your two small little girls and start moving them back and forth between Europe and the United States. And they said, actually, no, we're going to do that. And I think I owe everything to that decision that they made. Being placed in incredibly stimulating and fascinating environments, both spatially, moved to Paris when I was 2.5 years old with my parents, then moved back to California and so forth. And being invited to read from the very earliest possible day. I actually was a bit hesitant about reading because I didn't like the sorts of books I was given in school. And so babysitters or whatsoever. And then the miracle was that my parents decided that it would be a great idea to give me a copy of the Asterisk Le Gaulois, the illustrated comic books in French when I was little. And it was like, no, I really have to learn how to read. This is going to be very exciting. So, I moved on to things a bit more sophisticated, but actually Asterisk comic books, reading with my dad, is like my first real reading memory. And then moved on to other things, Tolkien and some children's literature as well, although I read less children's lit. I was mostly drawn to reading classical. I was addicted to the Three Musketeers when I was about 6 or 7 years old and absolutely committed to adventure stories of all sorts, and then moved on to Conan Doyle and such.
Amazing. So when I was growing up, I think Asterix was a constant presence in our place as well. Asterix and Obelix was like one of those defining moments which my father read when he was a kid and then I read when I was a kid. So there's like a continuity there. But I'm curious, like when you mentioned Asterix and Obelix, and then very quickly you mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien. Amongst your peer group, were you a bit of an outlier in just the terms in the sophistication of things you were reading?
I don't know that I was. I was very fortunate that my parents made the decision to put me in schools that were with very small classes and lots of people who were pretty committed. There were a fair number of academic children. There were quite a lot of international children where parents were in business or in the diplomatic corps or something like that. And my best friend was also what I would call a fac brat, like me, a faculty child. And so Dora and I used to challenge each other to see what we could read and what we could make sense. So I think, yes, I had friends who were more STEM orientated and they read a little bit less, but actually all of us really liked reading. And by the time when we were 14, we created a German philosophy club, for example, to resonate with your Schopenhauer comment, and sort of sat around dressed all in black reading Nietzsche in a fairly sort of adolescent but at the time deeply pleasing way.
Amazing. So that is rare. 14-year-olds building a German philosophy club. At 28, I can barely get my head around German philosophy. So I'm curious how you were doing it at 14. But that takes me to an interesting point. Usually when people start reading classics, like I remember I had gotten hold of a Dostoevsky book, I think when I was 15 or 16. And I didn't quite appreciate it that well. So I'm curious that now when you look at young kids who, let's say, want to start reading Tolstoy at 14 or 15, is there a right age to get introduced to certain books?
So my simple answer would be no, there isn't a right age, because you'll just get very different things from the book depending upon when you read it. In some sense, one could say that the last book that you read on the day you die is the perfect time to read it, because the fullness of your life and experience will be there to appreciate it. I got rather committed to Dostoevsky, predictably being interested in Nietzsche as well, more than Tolstoy, actually. And no, what I was getting out of Преступление и наказание, Crime and Punishment, when I was 14 and read it the first time together with Dora, is pretty different to the way I read it now, having supervised a dissertation about Dostoevsky. Both were deeply pleasing, though. I do think sometimes a text can be so alarming that you want to be a little careful about giving it to a child. But frankly, if one's in a stressful historical moment, it might be just as hard to read when one's 25 or 45. So I think it's about the proficiency, about the way that you interact, and the pleasure of rereading.
Amazing. So when you look at classics, perhaps, that it takes me to my next question. Is there a specific reason why a book, like when would a book be considered a classic? Is it when you can reread it and every time rediscover something new?
So, I mean, such a controversial question in my field. What is the classical canon of literature, often very specifically situated around whether diverse authors on the one hand or contemporary authors on another hand can ever really achieve the status of classic? Some versions, and most versions of the notion of classic, involve an emphasis on the durability of interest in it, that it is readable multiply, in several ways, by multiple readers in multiple time periods, and perhaps repeatedly by a single given reader. So I think the notion that a text manages to reach out to a large number of people is a wonderfully desirable and democratic one. I think the definition of a classic would be, from my point of view, if I wanted to go down that route and actually teach a grad seminar that kind of critiques the whole notion of classic, actually, so I have to be careful not to contradict myself here. If I were to try to create the notion of a classic, it would actually be about its agility, the ways in which it is able to be meaningful in multiplicities of settings, which could be transtemporal. There's a faculty member who's now at Harvard. He used to be at Columbia and was my mentor when I was a graduate student. And he has this notion of a world literature or classical literature, because I think those two have a lot in common potentially, being something that's elliptical, something that is incredibly impactful for someone who knows the setting, the context, the particularity of it, but it's also very legible and very pleasing and very impactful when read at a distance by someone who doesn't know the culture, who doesn't know the author. So I think I might want to lean into Damrosch's notion of world literature to define classics. And it is this capacity to be what he calls elliptical, to address two different poles of readership: the expert reader, the specific reader, and also the general reader who can pick it up and still get something out of it.
So as you grew up from, let's say, the 14-year-old Elizabeth, who's in the German philosophy club, to a grad student to now a teacher, have you also taken this journey from being the general reader to the expert reader? And how the way you've read a book, how's that changed? Like now when you pick up a new book, are you looking at something fundamentally very different than what you were before as a child, perhaps when you were reading just for pleasure?
So I obviously haven't stopped wearing black. So one flippant answer would be that I never quite grew up. So I had various possible career options, even when I was a graduate student, not all of which included staying in expressive cultural studies, working particularly with literary texts. So what I would say is that the pleasure of reading, plaisir du texte, as someone like Roland Barthes would say, the pleasure of the text has never diminished. So I do this because I love to do this. I could be doing something else even at this minute and certainly could have chosen a different path. What has happened, and it's about questions of expertise and technique, is that I learned to ask a greater range of questions of a text, in no way diminishing the pleasure of the reading experience, and to make more of the features of the text, and to be able to describe why the text functioned in its way, how it might be important that it functioned in this way, in more technical and more precise terms. And I find that with students as well. I don't require students in my classes, for example, to know technical film criticism. You can talk about the way that a scene in a film works without a single technical piece of language from film studies. Same is true of literary analysis. You don't need to know the difference between a syndeton and synecdoche to be able to explain why a paragraph is startling and striking. But if you do know classical rhetoric, or if you have read literary theory, there's a kind of precision that you acquire for talking to someone who wants to be that precise about why the text does what it does. But the pleasure, that never diminishes.
Wonderful. So when you talk about the questions that when you're reading a text, you ask more questions. Oftentimes, the questions we ask are rooted in the cultural zeitgeist. So they are modern sensibilities. Reading texts which were written in the 19th century, 18th century, and sort of trying to analyze them with modern sensibilities. How do you look at that whole process? Isn't there like something inherently discordant in that, where the cultural sensitivities of today cannot be projected onto the authors who were writing in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s? So how does the reader reconcile that?
It's a very important question, because you're touching on the idea of anachronism, for example, of importing a frame of reference or a cultural context that really is not relevant. And it could equally be talking transnationally across cultures in a synchronic moment, equally. So I think I'm going to use again, actually, since we began with Schopenhauer, so this is Schleiermacher rather than Schopenhauer or Nietzsche. So Schleiermacher is asked how to interpret, in his context, he's thinking about sacred texts. And he's asked about the disconnect between what the sacred text might have originally meant and how it might appear to somebody, in his case, say, in 1820. And his answer is that texts acquire additional meanings over time. So I spend quite a lot of time and do very historicist work. I'll be heading to do some very historicist work on a Russian emigre in Paris just at the end of the semester. So I'm very preoccupied with what exactly could we reconstruct about the way this text came to be in the world, why the author might have chosen the particular phraseology, symbology, ideology, etc. That being said, that isn't the whole answer for me, and that's partly pedagogical as well as intellectual. The text, we were speaking of classics, the text needs to be one that is still readable today. Not only something that's writerly based on what the author may or may not have wished and how much of that we can reconstruct. So from my point of view, the crucial thing is simply to explain which frame of reference, which context you're invoking. If you pass a judgment, say, about intersectional diversity around a text written in 1890, you would want to make clear that literally the language you're using is not available to the author who wrote in 1890, but it doesn't mean, in my view, that it's inappropriate as a response to the text. And that's one of the reasons I get really excited to see what new meanings students and scholars as well give to texts over time. They're not misreadings, they're additional readings.
So, and when you start, so I was reading this piece by Rose Horowitz, which is actually going viral over the last few weeks. It appeared in the Atlantic, and it was about the falling levels of reading at all the elite classrooms, specifically in the liberal arts context, where professors complain how back in their day they would read multiple books in one semester. Now students seem to have not even complete one book in one semester. I'm curious, when you're teaching undergraduates, have you seen a drop in the levels of reading from, let's say, when you were a student?
So I think people read differently. So if the specific question is there a drop in the level of reading, I would want to rephrase it and say there's been a change in the modality of reading. If your goal is to have students cover 250 pages in 2 different novels in a week, as well as reading 2 400-page history books, I think a 2024 student might be really challenged by that. Also, if I'm being truthful with myself, unless you were someone who loved reading literary texts or long historical studies, my contemporaries in the 1980s and 1990s didn't read carefully 250 pages times 2 and 400 pages times 2. Some of us, I was very fortunate because I did political speaking and debate, had systematic training in how to work with very large amounts of verbal material very efficiently. So maybe that's the one thing I would say is a difference. But it wasn't a widespread skill, actually, even when I was a student, is strategies for what you could broadly call skimming, extracting efficiently from especially a text that's not fundamentally, primarily creative and fictional, is something that I don't think people get invited to do. They don't get invited to do it in school. It's therefore something they'd have to acquire at university. So that's the missing piece, but it wasn't entirely robustly there 40 years ago either, to be blunt.
Okay, so, and do you think when students come into the college, let's say it's undergraduate day 1, their level of preparedness with, let's say, the canon, right? Having read some amount of Shakespeare, some Jane Austen, some Hemingway, things like that. Do you see a change in that readability, for lack of a better word?
Because everyone talks about cultural literacy, I suppose, is the phrase. If we go back to the 20th century, that's what we're talking about here. So my field is comparative literature, even though I'm housed in an English department, which means that I work in multiple languages. So I actually, again, would want to interrogate the question. The authors that you mentioned are often considered canonical and global, talking about Shakespeare or Austen, for example, but they're English language and they're historical. And so somebody coming from a very different tradition might or might not need to know those. I mean, the British Empire, for good or ill, was widespread. English language, as many critics like Guillory and so forth have talked about, and Larry Venuti working on translation, has a kind of cultural capital and a kind of global dominance, which is distinctive. But one of the things that's actually rather nice, because I teach world literature and I teach international things, is it's just as useful for me if somebody knows the story of Sakuntala as it is if somebody knows the story of Hamlet. It's just as helpful for me if someone's primary ethical frame of reference is Confucianism as it is if they're Aristotle, because the syllabi and courses I teach in many, many cases depend upon transnational and transcultural bases. And I really am not interested in deriving everything as dominant as the Greco-Roman British Empire-driven matrix is, seeing that as the only frame of reference.
This is wonderful. I mean, the fact that you mentioned Shakuntala and Shakespeare and that in like the same breath is such a welcome thing to hear, at least for the Indian. Do you find that mode of teaching and that philosophy towards pedagogy is rare, or is that does everyone do it, or does it, or like do you make it very intentional that, hey, I want to be that sort of a teacher, irrespective of whether anyone else is doing it or not?
I think there are colleagues. I have wonderful colleagues at UT and at other campuses, and collaboratively, we are very committed to doing this work in terms of having the most exciting and diverse possible syllabus for people, not only in terms of the works read, but also in terms of the activities students are invited to undertake in relationship to those texts. That being said, I think there is a tendency for people to remain somewhat siloed within a single world language. The questions of expertise, a field such as mine, comparative literature, is problem-driven. We tend to be asking a theoretical question that crosses national and linguistic boundaries. Other people's formation can be much more linear in relationship to a single language or a singular imperial context. So it is extremely intentional in my mind. Going back to your very first question about, is it what happens to you when you're a small child that determines the way that you will be? I always joke with people that, and yet I mean it, that on the one hand, I teach comparative literature and that's my training. But on the other hand, I am comparative literature. I can't think in a single language or in a single location. I am much more European, East and West European dominant than any other part of the world. But because of the cities that I lived in were places like London and the San Francisco Bay Area, they were always connected with parts of the world that had nothing to do with that very small, strange thing that's on the edge of the large continent that we call Europe these days. So it's very intentional, but and I'm thinking it through at the level of pedagogy, it's very intentional. But for me, it's existential. It's simply who I am. If you say Shakespeare, I'm going to say Kalidasa. I'm not going to say another Renaissance English author. That's what will come into my mind.
Absolutely, amen to that. And I would probably say Kalidasa to begin with. So that's amazing. But talking about London and talking about San Francisco, again, take me back to that childhood. Like when you were, these are inherently very different worlds. Did you have a specific favorite, like growing up studying in Oxford and of course studying in America? How were the two campuses very different? And what were like what were the frameworks you were gaining at these two very different places?
So the two cities, and then we lived in Italy as well as in France as well. The two cities of London and San Francisco Bay Area, they're very different, of course, in all sorts of ways. Oscar Wilde's famous quip about San Francisco being a London-based author is it's where people go to disappear. So famously, Londoners are both enthralled by the specter of California and also slightly alarmed by the specter of California as well. I did find that the two American universities that I studied at, UC Berkeley and Columbia, had very important things in common, even though they're very different types of institution. They were both places of extreme intellectual rigor. They were both places with quite markedly left-wing politics as the dominant modality. They're both very metropolitan and urban campuses, obviously New York City being particularly intensive. I lived in Oxford as a child, going to school in the countryside outside of Oxford. And so it's a place that I knew really well from being, 9 or 10 years old. That was when I began studying Latin. I found that there were great strengths to both traditions and to each locality. The American system tends to be much more fastidious in scholarly terms in my field, so much more about research and documentation. Broadly, these are somewhat, crass categories. Broadly speaking, the emphasis, both in terms of the way you're trained and what you're validated for if you write, is the British was much more robustly argumentative. So it was the clarity and the intensity of the insight. So as a child, I was taken back and forth because my parents wanted me to experience both. As an adult, I could have just picked one, and instead decided to go back and forth because I thought each had something to recommend itself. The place I felt most at home, in fact, was New York City, because it's the only place I've ever lived, certainly including Austin, where in order, if you like, to fit in order to be validated, of course, I'm not a native New Yorker, the only thing I seemed to need to do for things to go quite smoothly was to want to be there. Whereas everywhere else I've been in the US too much and in other places ever to be English or British, whatever that might be. I'm obviously not Californian, and I'm certainly not convincingly Texan. Everywhere else I was always an outsider, but there's a funny way in which the ultimate definition of being an insider in New York is that you really wanted to be there, and I did really want to be there. So that's actually where I felt most comfortable. And the bigger and more cosmopolitan the city, the more at home I feel more generally, but especially in New York.
And we'll come to the fact that you have a specific penchant towards really enjoying literature centered around bigger cities later, and I think that goes to the point you were making about finding yourself to be completely at home in New York. I'm curious, when you talk about the different types of pedagogies, at least in the liberal arts in both UK and US, how do you look at the present day status of the liberal arts? There's a common sentiment that the liberal arts are under attack all over the world. How are the things different at, let's say, a Columbia or UC Berkeley today versus at an Oxford or a Cambridge?
So I have to be very humble because I don't teach there. Both my sister and her husband do. She teaches at Oxford, actually, and he teaches at the University of Bristol. So I've PhD students whom I've had the honor of supervising who teach in the British system. The British system has always been smaller, and therefore in certain ways literally scale. It's always been smaller than the US one, with more limited opportunities just numerically. It also has instituted a very complex system of evaluation and rankings across programs, ones that are ultimately not entirely well suited to the humanities and better suited to certain sorts of other quantitative fields. So my sense is that in the UK, the particularity of the attack on the humanities that is often experienced at an ideological level is often not as insistent as it is in the United States. And certain sorts of US institutions, those that are privately funded, those that are in states that haven't explicitly singled out, for example, the humanities as having a particular political or ideological bent, that the British humanistic fields are not as under attack in that kind of direct and targeted way as the US ones are. Some of the systems of the way in which programs are evaluated, however, are arguably a little bit more problematic in certain sorts of ways. Broadly speaking, I think the humanities, if I can be so presumptuous, has not made the best case for itself over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm someone who does highly theoretical work, so I really appreciate that style of thinking and writing, and I think that kind of complexity and precision is worthwhile. But I also think that if you can't express some version of that idea to 500 first year students, you might want to reflect on that idea and think about whether it actually makes sense. And so I think we have not been as communicative as we should have been. And it's one of the reasons I've always been committed to teaching large first and second year undergraduate lecture courses, and I do a lot of work with corporate consulting and with non-UT and non-university based entities, both because it's exciting to me to work with different people and also because it keeps me honest.
Amazing. When you were talking about the ranking system not being the most precise for a discipline as the liberal arts, I was reminded of India. The famous economist Karthik Muralidharan wrote his entire piece about how the Indian education system is more of a sorting system than a human growth system. And arguably the liberal arts in India, like we've absolutely shunted them, which is quite an irony for given India's cultural heritage, right? So, you talked about the case for the liberal education. I was reminded of Fareed Zakaria's amazing book, which talks about the case for a liberal arts degree. So I think my question would be, what is the eventual case for a liberal arts degree in the 21st century? What is the best case scenario? What is the precise value add which you feel a liberal arts education can give to, let's say, a student of business, an engineering student, things like that?
So I'm going to rely upon the ideas of Kwame Anthony Appiah. He's a Ghanaian British philosopher who teaches at Penn just at the moment. And he has a book on cosmopolitanism in which he asks, how is it that we can come to care about people who are not close to us, using his exact terminology, people who are not like us. And by this, he means not finding what is in common among people who are apparently different from each other, but actually approaching them and letting them remain different. And he has several things that he says are important. But one of the ones that he specifically singles out, he's a philosopher who's focusing particularly on questions of ethics, is that fundamental to humans being able to work with each other without erasing or forgetting our differences is that we enjoy telling and responding to stories. And every humanistic field in certain sorts of ways, and actually that would include many of the social sciences as well, although in a very different modality. So liberal arts quite generally are particularly focused on telling stories and on then responding to somebody else's story. It's fundamentally human. Aristotle says that, Appiah says that. So why do I mention this as the value added? Because Appiah says without these stories that we enjoy telling to each other and making sense of, if they are not our stories, there is no possibility for what he thinks is the fundamental way that human beings can and must try to interact with each other. To have enough in common in order to have a conversation, not to agree, but to have a conversation with somebody who's not like you and who does not agree with you. And that's actually how I build all the trainings I do in strategic thinking for non-liberal arts students, for people who are, in business positions, who are in C-suites and so forth, who realize that they're actually no longer able to work either with a different generation or with a colleague who has a different point of view. So the value add is just that. I wouldn't want someone who's a business major to switch to another major. I wouldn't want somebody who's STEM to say, oh my goodness, I'm not trying to, recruit you to the liberal arts, but I think you're losing out on an opportunity that will be professionally invaluable. Just as having done lots of maths and computing myself, I think I would be missing out on something if I hadn't had some of those skills that are in principle very different from what my profession is.
So do you think when you look at if you sit at the side of the liberal arts and then you look at the usual STEM curriculums all over the world, do you think there is a very obvious lack of a social science / liberal arts element to a lot of STEM curriculums, where we might be over-indexing on our ability to code, but really under-indexing on our ability to read, interact, things like that?
I actually really do. So if I take something that's regularly on a STEM curriculum, so let's pick something like technical writing. Often the focus in a technical writing class, and I have a colleague who teaches technical writing in Silicon Valley, who's been very successful because that's not what they do. They don't teach it actually as a class in rhetoric. They teach it as a class in precision and in clarity. So clarity is important, obviously, if you're telling someone how to do something. And most STEM programs have some version of this. Others will go further. They'll have a course in ethics or something like that. But they tend to be too narrow and particular and technical in their focus, and to be a little bit less about communicative skills, whether those be writerly or whether they be something that's going to be encountered in a live conversational modality. And so again, it's often an afterthought because there seems to be such a direct career trajectory from certain rather specialized fields like computer science, for example, to a job that would be in computer science. There are, however, such a range of computer science jobs that purely being able to code is obviously crucial, but it's not going to be sufficient. And if someone wants to take on leadership positions, including in areas like design, the capacity to be able to converse with others, to go back to Appiah's word, is essential. I mean, that's actually important if you're doing coding and staying in the purely technical. If you have any managerial aspirations, then it would become an essential skill.
Talking about the ability to tell stories, let's come to theater. Now, I did theater for a very long time in India. You, of course, did your dissertation, your thesis in theater. So tell us about what attracted you to theater. Like, why was that the chosen major, and how was your experiences working with Renaissance theater?
So The quickest way to say it is I appreciate theatre because it pulls off the largest number of different aesthetic things live of any medium I can think of. It does more quickly, more complexly, and in real time. By contrast, for example, with cinema, which can be, depending on the style of cinema, of course, can be reworked subsequently. So just as I have a particular disposition for live music performance, so too the liveness of things, whether it's the dialogue you have in a seminar with students, whether it's real-time interaction in with a large lecture class, that liveness is extremely exciting to me, the vividness that it provides. And the multimediality of theatre, the types of plays that I've mostly been drawn to, including the Renaissance ones, which, because they were canonical, were the ones I worked on at the beginning of my career, recommended by my dissertation supervisor, are very, very elaborate and complex and spectacular and flamboyant. And so I'm very interested in things that have, because the topic that maybe fascinates me the most analytically is visual epistemology. What is the relationship between what we see and what we are being told, or how we are being expected to understand what we see? And so that relationship between epistemology and visuality is at the core of everything that I'm interested in fact. And drama does it, and does it spectacularly. It also asks and answers really effectively your question about bringing up potentially anachronistic understandings to a work. So in some sense, a novel is a novel, and you could always re-edit it and change the text and decide you wanted to correct it from, some version that the author created that has suddenly appeared, and now you realize you want to re-edit, like Proust's collection, for example, about 30 years ago. Drama only exists in the live performance. A drama is not a script. A script is a script. And so I have the luxury when I work with theatre that there's Hamlet, and I can think about it as being a 1601 thing created in a certain location, and I know a certain amount about how it would have been performed. But I work a great deal on avant-garde contemporary productions of classical plays. I particularly work on Russian productions. And so Hamlet for me is also what, I can't get to Moscow now to see it. Hamlet to me is what I was watching live in January of 2020 before COVID when I was last in Moscow. That's just as much Hamlet, and its year of creation is 2020 as well as 1601.
So what you're saying is theater sort of lends itself to reinterpretation in a much more seamless way than perhaps literature. So specifically for, you mentioned avant-garde. Could you take us through what do these technical terms mean, and what were the various epochs in theater? So there's Renaissance, there's modern. How is modern different from avant-garde? What were these different phases?
So if we stay with the Western tradition, obviously we could start talking about the Nanti Shastra as well. But if we stay with the Western tradition, we're obviously working with a privileging of the tragic over the comic, because we lost Aristotle's book, treatise on what comedy should have as its characteristics. We also didn't have in place Aristotle's treatise on poetics because it was preserved in the Arabic tradition, not in the European tradition. So largely we have a view of drama as rhetorical. Indeed, we have politicians like Sir Philip Sidney defending, even when everyone got very uneasy that drama, medieval drama, being Catholic was so problematic, defending students, for example, doing plays, such as yourself, because it was good training on how to speak well and how to present oneself effectively, which would be an important part of being in leadership roles subsequently. So there's a popular type of drama, as well as an elite type of intellectual drama in the 16th century. Other than people like me, almost no one focuses on the academic drama. We all care about the big box office stuff that was being done in London. People who are uneasy, of course, shut it down. And so in 1642, all the theatres shut, except the student plays, which continue seamlessly. When the monarchy comes back after the Civil War, they've got a really good taste for French theatre. We stay with the English tradition and Italian theatre. And so the theatres reopen. And so in the 1660s, things begin to start up again, but with a new influence, including things like, for example, having female performers on stage, which had been forbidden in the Renaissance. So in some sense, one could talk about Shakespearean tragedy as being avant-garde because it's breaking with some of the medieval tradition. One could talk about Aristotle's ideas about tragedy being avant-garde because they hadn't been part of it. Certainly the changes made in the 1660s were avant-garde compared to what Shakespeare was doing. They get sufficiently avant-garde in the end of the 16th century. If we use that, it's an anachronistic word because it's invented later, but they get sufficiently innovative, let's put it that way, in the early 18th century that the 1737 Censorship Act is passed. The plays are so controversial, they have so much political as well as sexual content in them that it gets shut down again. And we get this very polite neoclassical and sentimental theatre for a while that you have to really read very carefully to find something innovative in. And we have closet drama. And the avant-garde is sufficient with people like Byron and Shelley that their plays are unperformable. They can't logistically be done on stage, and they can't substantively be done on stage. And the writers writing those plays know they're not going to be staged. And then there's a continuity of sentimental comedy all the way through the 19th century, and a continuity from the 18th century tragedies that sort of manifests itself in the heightened emotion of what's called a melodrama, which literally means it has incidental music, but effectively also involves the notion of heightened emotion on the one hand, and pretty strong senses, at least in principle, of narrative closure. And that will take us right to the end of the 19th century, where Britain and US kind of continue in that mode, but something very crucial is happening on the continent with people like Henrik Ibsen in Scandinavia, and a new notion of how plays should be done, and then particularly the collaboration between Anton Pavlovich Chekhov and Konstantin Stanislavski at the Moscow Art Theatre, which reimagines a play inherently, and especially the style of acting that would be used for such a play. And from then on, I mean, each moment has people who are, if you like, drawing on what has been successful, I think, and continuing in versions of that are more dependent on continuity. And then there are outliers. And then it's interesting sort of to watch, if we think about our current moment even, what are the outliers that might in fact be the harbingers of something like Stanislavski's system, which became our very familiar practice of method acting.
Yeah, particularly for someone like Ibsen. And then we keep on going ahead from there and reach, let's say, a Beckett or something like that. There's a clear shift where absurdist plays the whole idea. For example, the whole idea for Waiting for Godot is there is no real story as such. There is a meta element to it. When these plays sort of came out for the first time, was there a big backlash from the quote-unquote mainstream that, hey, this makes no sense? What is this all about?
There was. I mean, it took several decades for Mont Neslin to write his book, The Theatre of the Absurd, which suggests that it is not the play that has changed, it is the worldview that has changed. The world, as you say, it makes no sense. It doesn't make no sense because Beckett is an incompetent author. It makes no sense in the conventional narrative sense, narratological sense, or implotment sense that one would talk about in theatre, because the world no longer does. And so in some ways, Waiting for Godot is unusual, it's peculiar, it is certainly avant-garde. But if one imagines that it is directly a response to the interwar period, obviously written during the context of the Second World War, one of the things I do with sort of strange movements like Dada and Surrealism and Absurdism, which I do pretty regularly teach, is I suggest that actually they might be rather more mimetic than you imagine. And this is inspired by an exhibit I saw many years ago in the San Francisco Bay Area called Anxious Visions. And it was a visual culture rather than a drama exhibition. It was one in which images that were photographic were juxtaposed with extremely recognizable, surrealist, very strange and bizarre, dreamlike paintings. And they were in fact exactly parallel. So I think there are people who reject it because it's peculiar, and it's strange. It's alienating stylistically in certain ways. I think one of the things that might be rather more important is that it's a kind of denialism about things that are changing in the world. A nostalgia for grand narratives of coherence somehow being sufficient to meet the moment and maybe even account for the moment. So I actually would take it even more seriously. So a famous case in point, in addition to Beckett, would be someone like Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, which was soundly denounced as being just unbearably dull and uninteresting and pointless. And yet, I think it's a brilliant play, incredibly menacing and sophisticated. In the 1950s in the UK, I think this was an almost unbearable mirror being held up to a culture that was in decline and nominal success, if you like, in the war. So as I said, it's not only that Pinter writes funny dialogue and has the actors speak quite slowly, it's that it's an image of the UK that the London public was not ready to have.
Makes sense. Within all of these different theatrical movements, was there something called Gothic theater as well? So I'm curious. So I'm sort of shifting gears and moving into what was supposed to be the main topic of our conversation, but since there's so many interesting things to talk about, we haven't really gotten to it, and that's Oscar Wilde and Picture of Dorian Gray and things like that. What is Gothic? So I know Gothic has different connotations for architecture. Gothic has different connotations for music. Was there Gothic theater? What was this term all about, and where do you trace the origins of the Gothic movement?
So, as many people have noted, originally it was a term used to insult medieval art as being unsophisticated, as being underdeveloped. So the word exists initially as a slur in certain sorts of ways, just the way modernism and modern is a slur initially and then gets, appropriated by the practitioners of that style. I'll say for clarity, with the English tradition, which is the most persistent Gothic tradition, more so than Germany or Austria or France, although they have got Gothic traditions there as well. The first, I think, and that's perhaps why it's so strong in theatre, the first explicitly Gothic playwright is Shakespeare, who insistently writes neo-medieval plays. They have elements of medieval theatre in them, so they're Gothic in terms of form, and they're thematically, particularly the history plays, directly drawing on the history of the Middle Ages and medieval practices like feudalism, like the international conflicts, questions of gender and magic even come into several of them, Hamlet and Macbeth being the two most obvious cases in point. So core to the English tradition is neoclassicism, of things like Julius Caesar, but in fact, sort of the most persistently admired play over time globally of Shakespeare seems to have been Hamlet, which is an explicitly Gothic play, including, so what is the definition of the Gothic? Including a firm and unapologetic embrace of medieval topics, medieval settings, the supernatural, and the macabre all the way through. And so in given moments, the Gothic is dismissed. It's dismissed as simultaneously effeminate and the kind of thing that young female identified people shouldn't be allowed to read. So it's a paradox that it's always somehow gendered as lesser, as being insufficiently bright, sunshiny, rational, I suppose. Our sense of the Gothic, I think, draws strongly on Shakespeare, but it really depends on something that happened in the late 18th century as a reaction to neoclassicism, beginning with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto as the most successful. It's always a great case in point to mention that novel because it's written by the Prime Minister, but he publishes it without his name on it because he's too worried that it will jeopardize his reputation to have written a Gothic novel because it's such a sort of trashy, disreputable thing to have done. He owns it ultimately because it's a wildly successful text. So I actually teach and regularly work on late 18th into 19th century versions of the Gothic. It becomes a national project in the 19th century, architecturally, as you say, with people like Pugin, not tearing down neoclassical buildings in London. Those are all there. All the Christopher Wren churches and so forth are still there. But now insisting that, for example, the Houses of Parliament should be expanded in the Gothic style rather than refashioned in a neoclassical style. So it becomes nationalist. It becomes a way of differentiating in even potentially nativist ways, what it means to be British, what it means to be English, in the face not only of French or continental identity, but I think especially also in the case of a colonial and imperial identity, that there is this genealogy that Britain wants to create for itself. And I mean, of course, drama is perfect because it's visual, it's spectacular already, it's theatrical. There's a different kind of Gothic intensity one gets from reading prose, but it's so stageable. Probably the big early success is the almost instantaneous, within a matter of years, development of the staged versions of Frankenstein. There's some vampire plays and things like that in the 1780s that are really quite fun. Planchet's Bride of the Isles and things like that are great, but it's the immediate recognition that putting an actor in the role of Victor, putting another actor, he became incredibly successful for this, in the role of the creature is going to be a smash success on the stage. In the same period when Byron and Shelley's experimental plays are unperformable, this kind of a play is. And of course, Dracula is the huge success story at the end of the century.
And does Gothic theater and themes around the Gothic theater also lead itself to film noir by any chance?
Well, I mean, the literal sort of slang or short of hand for the transition into a certain very stylized version of cinema making is to talk about vamps. And so film noir is thematic in terms of certain content, because often the Gothic can be very close to the detective. It's about investigating something mysterious. So if I go back to my example of Hamlet, Hamlet is simultaneously Gothic. It's all about ghosts and so forth, and poisonings and old castles, etc. So it's got all the haunting stuff in it. But it's actually fundamentally a detective story. Who killed my dad? And can Hamlet assemble the evidence for that? So I think especially if we use Hamlet, I mean, Oedipus is a detective story too, but it's not Gothic. Hamlet is detective and is Gothic, and so the two come together. And noir is heavily invested in characters like the vamp character, the femme fatale, who's a regular figure, again, takes us back to Gertrude and to other characters, but certainly to her, a hybrid of elements of the Gothic, including the extreme stylization and heightened emotions on the one hand, and then this other kind of co-companion of the Gothic, especially throughout the 19th century, but maybe even before, of investigating something mysterious with a kind of detective-like approach to it as well.
And so in this entire Gothic paradigm of sorts, where does this Irishman who is sort of full of quips comes in and writes this picture about this person who wants to stay young forever, picture of Dorian Gray? Would that be considered a Gothic novel of sorts as well?
So Wilde, I think, is extraordinarily drawn to mimicking things he admires. So all of his Oscarisms are really Socratic paradoxes, and he practices them. I've worked on his notebooks where you can see him working out the best exact turn of phrase to create one of these Oscarisms, these paradoxes. So of course, he went to Oxford. He hugely admires Socrates. But in terms of English writers, who he most admires is Shakespeare. So he's going to attend, I think, to both sides of Shakespeare. And so we get his riff on Midsummer Night's Dream, unlike comedy set in a classical setting, with something like The Importance of Being Earnest. With something like Ideal Husband, which has a femme fatale, and it has a mystery at the center of it about a crooked land deal, and whether somebody's secret is going to sort of emerge, etc. He's tapping into the other side. Oh, Shakespeare has many more than just these two. Another side of Shakespeare. And so he writes plays that are literally Gothic right at the beginning of his career in the melodramatic style. They're very strange and they're not very successful. He comes up with a nominally comic framework for something like Ideal Husband, which is filled with Gothic elements, snake-shaped bracelets and all kinds of things that are pure Gothic. Picture of Dorian Gray is one of the three big novels that are themed on the Jack the Ripper cases, is even more explicitly Gothic. It is witty and funny in terms of its social satire, but it's brutally tragic in terms of its implantment and narrative from the very, very beginning. And in some ways, one could always playfully at least say that it's a kind of play. Whenever I read it with students, we just finished 150 students and I reading Picture of Dorian Gray. They're so struck by the fact that it's all dialogue. So it's kind of a play in prose.
Okay, and so particularly talking about Oscar Wilde, you mentioned there's a big reaction to Jack the Ripper. I presume Arthur Conan Doyle also wrote one of his early books as a reaction to Jack the Ripper case, right?
So I think, I mean, it's in everyone's imaginary. The triad that one invokes as being sustained narratives that are directly correlated to the Ripper case because of close readings. One can do this question you asked about reading things in their historical context would be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Dracula. So there are dozens of other things. Reimer's Varney the Vampire, for example, a serialized, highly popular sort of Penny Dreadful type text, is very much to do with Jack the Ripper as well. The fixation on crime, I think, is something that connects the Conan Doyle material quite strongly to London and the creation of his extremely unusual detective. And they're also drawing, because there are things like the Deacon Brodie case in Edinburgh, which is a historical case, which comes to be very publicly of interest to people once the sensational Ripper case is there. So there's also a kind of Gothic in the sense of rediscovery of various sorts of transgressions and a fascination with other sorts of serial killer cases that start emerging in the same period. But yes, I think the idea of Doyle in principle, like the successful defeating of Dracula in Stoker, Conan Doyle in principle reassuring us that someone like Holmes could always solve the problem and catch the villain is existentially or holistically a response to the unsolvedness of the Ripper case. It's not just their violence, but the impossibility, it seems, of being able to pin it on anyone. And if you do his various, if you like, opponents and villains against whom Holmes is trying to undertake investigations, many of them refract, for example, with some of the people who were called in or at least questioned or considered as possible candidates for being actually Jack the Ripper. So you have things like The Resident Patient, which is about a Russian emigre, and there's a great sense that it must be an East European Jewish recent immigrant who was responsible, etc.
I remember a movie, I think it was based on Edgar Allan Poe, Letters from Hell, if I'm not mistaken, something on those lines, and that had a big Jack the Ripper like background to it as well. But talking about the London of that time, so here's Oscar Wilde, who's just graduated from Oxford and he's coming back to London. Victorian morality is at its peak.
Mhm.
What was the London of Oscar Wilde's time, where he stood, like the London which he stood in such stark contrast to, with his way of dressing, with his way of writing? What was that London all about?
So Wilde literally reworked everything about his identity when he arrives to Oxford, including actually changing the way he spoke. So he didn't speak with an Irish accent. He had a quick-paced, relatively high-pitched, rapid way of speaking when he arrived. And he recognized at Oxford that was not going to conform to the kinds of expectations, especially around masculinity, that were appropriate. So Wilde is very unusual, but he's also curated his persona, his personality, it was the word that he used, in such a way as to optimize certain possibilities of being successful. So he recognized that inherently he was middle class and he was Irish, so he would never have access to the kinds of identities, in terms of owning those identities, that many of his friends, like Lord Alfred Douglas, would have. So he creates and curates this highly theatrical identity that is incredibly pleasing and delightful. And I would boldly suggest that although there would be people who would always have disapproved of him, the Marquis of Queensberry being the kind of person, conservative establishment individuals in particular, perhaps, of whatever class, he had actually come up with something that was highly successful. And so in 1895, when he has 3 plays on in London, and he's working on getting Salome on in Paris, a play that can't be performed for political reasons and religious reasons, as well as logistical ones in London, because it's written in French as well. At that moment, he's actually kind of at the height of success, and he's managed to balance his unusualness in such a strategic way that he is enormously successful. But I think he makes a crucial error, and he imagines that he can break the fundamental rule of Victorian society, which is not that certain things are undoable and certain things are doable, but that you have to do the right thing in the right place. So there are dozens of famous, and they were open secrets at the time, closeted homosexuals, if one wants to use that word for it, in London in the time, including major military and political figures. But they don't take, in Wilde's case, their lover to lunch in a public restaurant.
Okay.
It's just a violation of this core Victorian notion of propriety. Double lives are not a problem for Victorians, whether they are same-sex attractions or opposite sex or different sex attractions. Double lives are a problem if you get caught, or in Wilde's case, flagrantly force people to look at both halves of your life at the same time.
Makes sense. And I think that speaks a little, not just to the British sense of propriety, but also the underlying British sense of hypocrisy, which I guess, I mean, that's for a lot, that could be said for almost every society in the world, perhaps. The fact that Oscar Wilde, despite having the sort of genius which he did, was often not considered a part of the quote-unquote mainstream establishment as, let's say, George Bernard Shaw might have. This is despite the fact that Oscar Wilde was a pretty terrific Hellenist, and his work on the ancient Greeks is like exemplary. Why do you think that was? Was that also because of this decadence of sorts which Oscar Wilde was proudly exhibiting all over?
I think you've hit a very useful term for thinking about what was, in addition to the violations of notions of propriety and appropriateness, what was unnerving to the British. Wilde is not unnerving as an individual, as a personality, were he to be living in Paris. And people live far more openly than Wilde did without very much difficulty in Paris and in other parts of France, including in Calais, for example, which was very controlled by the British culturally as well as financially in the period. So you could be the Comte de Montesquieu and live in a certain sort of way with no difficulty, particularly in Paris. This notion, and it gets us back to shutting down theaters as a whole, he's decadent. He's an aesthete. He violates certain other principles around plain speech, around notions of sincerity, even if you're being comedic, of having a clear and earnest message to what it is that you're doing. And if on the one hand, that's considered pedagogically appropriate, that's the way tutorial works at Oxford, give and take, dialectical conversations as though you were chatting with Socrates. The use of paradox and irony, often unresolved paradoxes and ironies in Wilde, is, I think, something that feels decadent and somehow irresponsible. The other thing that I think, and this is something that interests me in my work, is that there is a kind of, despite writing terrible stories like Picture of Dorian Gray, there's a kind of gentleness about Wilde, a willingness to recognize that human beings are not ideal, that they mess up. Even before his own incarceration, he is deeply preoccupied with mercy and with forgiveness in a way that someone like Shaw is not. Shaw judges people and invites us to judge people. Wilde asks us to live with the guaranteed imperfections of our world and be more alarmed by something that appears to be perfect. And I think that also is at odds with at least some of the publicly announced and or aspirational values of, and I'll here add the British Empire, not just Londoners thinking about English people.
And just for context for all the listeners, the incarceration you talk about is during, like, because of the trials of Oscar Wilde, where he's supposed to be, the lover is Lord Alfred Douglas. The Marquis you mentioned was the uncle of Lord Alfred Douglas. Also, ironically, I think he founded the rules for boxing, perhaps. Yeah. So that's a strange little trivia. Specifically about the picture of Dorian Gray and this whole idea of unresolved paradoxes. But the way this whole story is set out, for someone who's reading the story for the first time, all the interesting dialogues are given to Lord Wotton. And he is charismatic, he's suave, and he's a bad influence. Mm-hmm. All the things which Wilde was eventually accused of being when the trial started. Do you think there's a bit of a autobiographical element to Lord Wotton when he's writing it?
So Wilde answered this question because everyone in the day, as they read the novel, noticed something of what you've just mentioned. Mm. And so the quip that Wilde comes up with is the following. Lord Henry Wotton is who everyone thinks I am. Dorian Gray is who I wish I were. Mm. Basil Hallward is who I actually am.
Oh,
and that's the kind of remark that on the one hand is beautiful because it's, of course, only the two artists. There are two artists in the story. One is a painter, Basil, and one is an actress, Sybil Vane. Only Sybil and Basil actually make anything. As you say, Henry Wotton is a parasite. Dorian is vapid at best and dangerous and cruel at worst. And so at least that was Wilde's answer to your question, is that it's actually arguably entirely autobiographical. Many of the characters are directly drawn from friends of Wilde. And if you know the particular individuals he was friends with and, that were living in London in the period, the portraits are as, they're like a Crassus of actual human beings, and just as good as a Singer Sargent portrait of them would be in giving you a sense of who they were. But particularly the three male identified characters at the core of it, because they're kind of four main characters, but especially the three males at the center of the conversation. In some sense, Wilde is all three of them.
Okay, makes sense. A lot of when you mentioned Bernard Shaw coming from a place of judgment and Oscar Wilde coming from a place of empathy, for lack of a better word, Wilde has this image for the modern reader as this forever hero of the ostracized, right? But I'm curious, you mentioned if Wilde had been in France, he would not have been hounded as badly as he was in London. After the exile, Wilde does go to France as well, right? That's where he eventually gives up his life. And those final years, they were not very comfortable despite being in Paris, right?
No, absolutely. In fact, he was given the chance. One of his friends was sitting with him in the hotel in London as the police were coming to arrest him. So the trial, the verdict, the conviction, but he is then allowed a moment to try a little bit to get his life sorted out before actually being incarcerated. And a friend of his had a train ticket to get him to Dover, to get him to Calais. And actually, varying historian to historian, many people think the police actually delayed, wanting Wilde to get away, to live in exile by choice rather than having to serve the 2 years of hard labor in a number of prisons, ultimately in Reading jail. So he, as soon as he was released, of course, he did take the ticket and did make his way to Paris, as he perhaps should have in 1895. He did do that in 1897. But the problem was, in this moment, he was unable to travel, including actually in France, because the scandal was so severe. He adopted a pseudonym based on a fictional character and the name of one of his ancestors. So he made himself Sebastian Melmoth, after the queer icon Saint Sebastian, and Melmoth, which is a character in one of his ancestors' novels, Melmoth the Wanderer. And that's the only names he could use. If he gave Oscar Wilde as a name, they wouldn't let him check into hotels. But when he went to jail, went to prison, everything that he owned was sold off. And so he had nothing to live on. Constance gave him a little bit of money from time to time. I've spent quite a lot of time. He has dozens and dozens of letters to friends begging for money. He has nothing to live on. And although it's a very chic 5-star hotel now, it's actually across the street from the flat in Paris where I lived as a child.
Wonderful.
The Hotel d'Alsace, which is where he died on the Rue des Beaux-Arts, in just a little bit from the original Sorbonne University campus, was considered very déclassé and not very elegant. Now it's super trendy and fashionable because it's where Oscar Wilde died and it's in a great neighborhood. But no, he died in extremely difficult circumstances, both financially and also socially and medically as well.
So I think as we begin to wrap up, my 3 final questions. You talked about Oscarisms, and you talked about of course, we talked about the picture of Dorian Gray. In addition to that, as a reader, as a teacher, things like that, which are your other favorite works of Oscar Wilde, which you would want people to know more about, and why do they appeal to you?
So I have a particular interest in his French play Salome, which has been adapted to operatic versions. That's probably the one that's most often encountered. So yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinarily interesting text. It's very, very quirky and strange. It also is the occasion for an exquisite set of illustrations by Aubrey Beardsley, which are very striking. So especially if someone's interested in plays and visualizations, that's sort of the most multimedia of the things that he created. I like all of his plays. I particularly like Ideal Husband because it's both political and it's got the comic and the paradoxical, and it's got a happy resolution. Nobody dies at the end of that one. What I found is uniquely impactful to multiple readers of whatever age and in whatever context. So this has worked with university students in the same way at Moscow State Linguistic University as it does with members of the Austin community who are not part of UT as it does with undergraduates. I think that his children's stories, usually collected under the title of one of them, The House of Pomegranates, are absolutely remarkable.
I think I read The Happy Prince, Canterville Ghost when I was in class 6th or 7th. Mr. Ducasse, he's no more with us, but he was a great teacher. And I think I rediscovered Oscar Wilde much later. And then I realized, that was him who wrote that story, which I so enjoyed back in the day. We used to have this book called the Oxford Reading Circle, and that was amazing. In addition to the other works of Oscar Wilde, he was undoubtedly one of the kings of quips, his Oscarisms. Which are your favorite, one of your 4 or 5 favorite Oscarisms?
So the one that's actually my wallpaper on my laptop, so every student that I work with sees it when I, project and so forth, is always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much.
Yes.
Which is an absolute classic. There are, friends stab you in the front.
Yes.
Is one of the most efficient and has a nice legacy in one of the vignettes from Paris Je t'aime, which is set in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which is where Oscar Wilde is buried. Always give in to temptation. I think I could keep on reciting various ones of them as well. Some of them are a little bit longer than others. And I think the shorter they are, the more impactful they are for readers and people who are experiencing, the text and their sort of particularities.
No, they're amazing. Completely agree. And I don't know if this was Oscar Wilde, that after a good meal, you can forgive everyone, even your own relatives. Something to that effect, right?
Exactly. I mean, as I said, they're just all so wonderful and so good. Some bring joy wherever they go. Some bring joy whenever they go.
Wonderful. Dr. Ajib, my penultimate question. We started by talking about your reading habits, how they've evolved and things like that. At my old workplace, I would often have a lot of colleagues who would ask me that, how is it that we can inculcate a reading habit.
Mhm.
While they themselves were not super interested in reading, a lot of them had kids and they were wondering how is it that they can get their kids to read. So I'm curious, like if you were to start advising young parents or prospective parents on how do they help their children pick up a reading habit, how would you advise them that they go about curating a reading habit when they themselves might not be big fans of reading as such?
So I think it's a matter of finding out what the child enjoys inherently. So I remember we had, and there was an attempt to try to get me to read in English more than was taking place, because this happened twice. Once when we were living in Florence and once when I was living in Paris. And so we were given various English language books that I was supposed to be learning to read as a little kid. And I thought they were all really stupid and boring, and I had literally no interest in reading them. And so I think it was a matter, and that's how I ended up with Asterisk, is one of the very first things I read. My parents wondered and actually asked me what I was interested in. And so, of course, it was helpful that being very little, that they gave me illustrated things. And then there was a girl who lived across the hallway from our apartment in Florence, and she loved comic books. And so I'd be given these incredibly boring, and I wouldn't have been able to do the full sort of ideological critique of them, but unacceptable, especially in gender terms books, to read that I just didn't want to read. And then, so I actually kind of learned to read in Italian and in French better sooner because I wanted to read them. So to my mind, it's all about creating the circumstances where the child is motivated to read. I only think intrinsic motivation exists and is sustainable. Extrinsic doesn't work. You promise the child, their favorite thing to eat after they read a book, they're not really ever going to enjoy reading. All you find out is how much they like chocolate-covered biscuits or whatever. But if you can find something that child really wants to read, and it might not be what you would have wanted to read, or might be like your father reading Asterisk and Obelisk together, that was key. And so I'm always trying, whatever the topic is that, a class I'm given, for example, says you're supposed to teach romanticism, or this needs to be a course on world literature. Part of me thinks, well, what does that topic entail? What should, conscientiously be on that syllabus? But then it's not a thing that I put on any syllabus without asking, do I think they'll enjoy reading this? Do I think they'll be engaged in reading this? And if it's a project that they're doing, I actually invite students. And so I would have the same thing with someone younger. I obviously work with university age people. I invite people to propose texts that are their passion, or materials that are their passion. And I find that that's the only pathway to it. You could decide it's practical to know how to read. Of course, that's true, but you're going to become a good reader. And by that, I mean a consistent and a productive reader, because you're looking at things you enjoy. And then you won't be as fed up with the things that are boring that you'd have to read for whatever reason as well.
And I think a carrot and stick policy, at least for reading, might not always work. There's some sort of that you nudge the kids towards reading a certain sort of things. I mean, I mentioned Asterix and Obelix. There's a bunch of Billy Bunters lying around. There's a bunch of Mad comics lying around, Marvel, DC, whatever. So definitely the fact that if you can grow up around books, that's a blessing. But if not, then probably just try and nudge the child towards more sort of cultural consumption and then see where it goes. Wonderful. I think this has been an extremely engaging conversation. I'll, of course, all the things we mentioned, I'll have it linked in the show notes, so that people can just go down rabbit holes and discover whatever, and just discover more fun stuff. Last question for my readers and myself: please recommend books, TV shows, music, movies which have meant a lot to you and you would want everyone to give it a try.
So my absolute favorite films, this is a perfect way to start off with it, not because the director is unproblematic, but just because I think it's incredibly remarkable, is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. I think it's extraordinary. And I think if you take that as a midpoint sort of in the 20th century, and I'm fascinated, I like his British films as well, but especially I find the encounter with English culture and Californian culture fascinating personally, of course. If one then wants to keep in mind all the things that lead up to Vertigo, on the French side, I would particularly emphasize for cinema something like Cocteau's Orpheus. I mean, not that Truffaut and so forth isn't remarkable, Alphaville and things like that, but I really do think that Cocteau's Orpheus is remarkable. And so someone who's rather familiar with things like The Matrix is going to find the Cocteau a really sort of crucial and interesting footnote. In the Russian tradition, Eisenstein is often mentioned as the sort of great figure there. But I actually think that Tarkovsky is just extraordinary. People often admire Stalker, which is a very interesting science fictional in certain sorts of ways dystopic piece. I'm actually most interested in Zerkala, The Mirror, which is the one about the bombing in the Second World War and childhood memories of the city of Moscow. So those are some of the ones that I am particularly drawn to. In the East Asian tradition, one tends to invoke someone like Kurosawa. And of those, I would probably, I mean, they're all quite remarkable. Kumanojo is really striking because of its so-called Kurosawa effect, because of the multiple narratives. Probably the most visually spectacular, it's the one I've used the most, would be Ran. Name of an Aristocrat, which means chaos. That's a like reworking of King Lear in certain sorts of ways. I mean, books is hard. I've got us to Japan. I'm a huge fan of Murakami Haruki. And I think it's witty and pleasurable and charming. All of them, Wind Up Bird, Wild Sheep Chase are very good. My favorite, though, of his works is After a Darku, which is the one about two sisters, and it takes place in the course of one overnight in the city of Tokyo. And so I'm interested in things that are a little bit playful along those lines, depending on people's level of patience. We've talked about a lot of the English writers. I wrote my master's thesis on Marcel Proust. I'm enormously drawn to Marcel Proust, contemporary writer that I've written about, and again, unapologetically, because his works are so entertaining and engaging. The nom de plume, the writer's name is Akunin Baris. His real name is Georgi Shakashvili. He's a Georgian, post-Soviet Georgian Japanologist who writes all kinds of things, including detective stories. And so these are the ones which have the protagonist called Fandorin. And he's a kind of a riff on Sherlock Holmes, but they're superbly written. And he wrote one each year starting in the 1990s, mapping current events in Russia onto what could have happened in 1905 or in 1901 or something like that.
Wonderful. You mentioned you went all the way to Japan and talked about Kurosawa. I'm curious, have you had a chance to watch any Satyajit Ray films? Anything from the Indian subcontinent? Please give us those recommendations as well.
So I have a particular, as I said, again, I may be betraying my own frivolity here. I love and use Lagan all the time.
Yeah.
So I'm not probably as knowledgeable or as current. There's certain things like Ashoka and so forth that I use to teach classical Indian texts and things like this. Okay. I fear that I've watched lots of films and I grew up, I would be hard-pressed to name them with the same level of precision and care because I don't speak Hindi and I do actually do some Japanese. But I watched so many of these series and in these films, both as a child and then probably even more when I was living in Moscow. And visit Moscow for the summer because Indian cinema is extremely popular in Moscow. And so it's one of the pleasures is being able to see how it's being received and taken there. So as I said, I have this personal favorite. I think Lagan is just so brilliantly and so beautifully done.
Lagan is a brilliant film. You mentioned Ibsen. In fact, Satyajit Ray has a movie which is an adaptation of Ibsen's Enemy of the People. It's called Ganashatru. It's a wonderful, it's a masterpiece, absolute masterpiece. And you talked about Kurosawa's King Lear, this, of course, Throne of Blood and everything. There's another Indian director who I feel has the most brilliant Shakespeare adaptations I've ever seen. His name is Vishal Bharadwaj, and he's done a trilogy of Macbeth, Othello, and Hamlet, Maqbool, Omkara, and Heather. And he's actually slightly tweaked the ending of Hamlet for Heather, which is almost blasphemy when you're looking to readapt Shakespeare. But if you liked Kurosawa, I can almost guarantee you might even enjoy Vishal Bharadwaj even a bit more than Kurosawa. Which, might be sacrilege for saying this, but I truly believe that.
No, I heard a beautiful paper actually about that film at a scholarly conference about the adaptation and about how to accommodate the need for a non-tragic ending at the end of the piece as well. And so, as I said, it's not surprising to me because I had the pleasure of working with a person who's now teaching in Canada on a beautiful dissertation some time ago that was actually on IPTA and the Indian People's Theatre Association, and specifically on the way in which Marxism and Shakespeare arrived in the 1940s. It went all the way back to thinking about the censorship and Neil Darpan and the plays in the 19th century, and then to think about what happened, especially in the environment of the 1930s and 1940s, the Shakespeare Vala of it all. So I appreciate you reminding me of that because I heard a great paper about it a few years ago and watched the film at that point, but I haven't watched it since. So
wonderful. Just all of these is bringing back memories. There's this book by Eric Barnau on Indian cinema. Absolute TIL moment when I read it back in the day. Wonderful. No, I think this has been absolutely amazing, Dr. Arji. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Again, everything would be linked in the show notes. I'm looking forward to, having many more conversations in the future. And thank you so much for your time. I hope you had fun as well.
I did, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation.